Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in. So we'll start with quickly all four of us introducing ourselves, and then we'll come back to sharing our experiences individually. I'm Devika Malik. I'm from India. I live with a disability called hemiplegia, and I'm also a carer to my mother who is paraplegic.
Hi, my name is Ntulila. I was born in Tanzania, and then I came to the UK and I grew up here. I'm based in London. I'm profoundly deaf, and British Sign Language is my first language. I am a representative in the diverse world. So, and I don't represent the global disability hub that I work for, but I work for them. But I am representing with speaking to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Joseph Migila from Tanzania, and I'm a person with albinism, and I do work with Tanzania Federation for Disabled People's Organization, and I'm happy to be into this meeting. I'm looking forward into this. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Pratishtha Deveshwar. I am from India and I live with paraplegia. I'm a wheelchair user.
Thank you so much, everyone who's joined us so far. I'm really excited to be able to moderate this session. We thought that it was really important for us to have a conversation like this because, like you heard from Lee in the beginning, people with disabilities, we live with certain social constraints. So that's why we also like to use the person first language when we say a person with a disability, because a lot of times you focus on the disability of the person before you focus on the person themselves. So when we take control of our identity and we say that we are a person first and we live with this disability, a lot of times a major part of that disability is caused not by my own inability, but by the constraints that the society poses or the environment poses in terms of inaccessibility of the infrastructure and of the mindset. And I think on that note, I would like to start with something positive that I hope to come out of this lockdown that we have experienced almost all over the world to be able to combat with COVID-19. Because now we are having everything done virtually. We are having artists perform virtually. We are having museums give virtual tours of their museums. We are having education which has moved online. People are working from home. So for a long time, people with disabilities have been told that the reasonable adjustments that they ask for to be able to be productive members of society are not possible, or basically they are not feasible. But now that the majority of the population is basically constrained in their mobility, we have seen that it is in fact possible and it is happening. And so I really hope that this is something that we as a community, as the entire world, learn and keep with us as a learning and take it forward. I think that is the most positive thing that can come out of this lockdown. And I personally in India run an organization called Wheeling Happiness Foundation. And our focus from day one has been to enable people with disabilities to fulfill their potential, identify their own sources of happiness, and fulfill their potential in that space. So it can be sports, it can be fashion, it can be education, anything that a person with a disability has put their mind to, and the kind of support that they need to fulfill their potential. It can be financial assistance, it can be assistance in terms of accessibility aids that they need to become mobile, but also advocacy, because it is important for people with disabilities themselves, especially in urban rural areas, and also our peers without disabilities, to understand how to be more inclusive, what the rights of people with disabilities are, and how we can be more inclusive as a society. So we do a lot of workshops in rural areas where we gather the people with disabilities of that area as well as their caregivers, along with the local officials, and talk about what their rights are, what what is some basic paperwork that is required for them to be able to claim those benefits from the government. But of course, during this lockdown, we have put a hold on those public gatherings because that is clearly not advisable right now. And I personally have also had to be extra cautious because, like I said earlier, I'm a caregiver to my mother who is paralyzed from below the chest. So there is a lot of physical assistance that is required in her movements, though she is way more independent than I'll ever be. But there is some physical assistance that is required to be able to make that possible. So living with people who have these kind of pre-existing conditions, we have to be even more careful that we don't cause them to come into contact with any possibility of catching this virus, because that is where, again, the lives of people with disabilities, how they are doubly at risk because of this virus comes into play. Because we have seen this not just in India, but all over the world. There are reports coming in all the time where we are talking about how the treatment facilities are not completely accessible. In fact, a lot of times there are anecdotes coming up that treatment for people with disabilities is not even prioritized in some places, especially in the initial months when the healthcare system was really burdened. Reports came in talking about how if time comes or if they have to make a choice, they may not prioritize the lives of people with disabilities. So that is one challenge that came up. And the other thing is people with disabilities who are dependent, who have complex needs and who are dependent on their caregivers. In case their caregivers are quarantined, which has happened, we have had a case like that recently in India that we've heard about. Also, another anecdote like that came through from China as well. So those dependent individuals are left to fend for themselves. And that can be a very confusing and very health-threatening time for those individuals because they don't have the caregivers that they are dependent on. Some of the other challenges we've seen over here is that in the initial months of the lockdown, we had people who were offered passes because they were considered essential workers. So they had passes to move even though there was a lockdown and a quarantine. But the caregivers, especially the part-time caregivers who visit you to take care of your assistance needs, they were not given these passes. So that was a very good example of how activism played a positive role, because the moment that came to light, a lot of disability activists in India stood up against that and made sure that that was rectified, though it took some time. But after the initial 1 month, they were able to make sure that those caregivers were considered essential workers and they were allowed those passes. Another challenge that we are well aware of is that once your mobility is restricted, the delivery of essential goods and making sure that you are safe from violence, because clearly 1 in 7 people in the world has a disability. So we are the largest minority. But again, if you look at it specifically from the perspective of women, it is said that 1 in 5 women live with some form of disability. And obviously we have seen reports from all over the world of the cases of domestic violence rising during the lockdown. And it is with something like that that a woman with disability becomes doubly vulnerable. And of course, access to things like basic medical kits, sanitary kits, which are very important for women and people with disabilities. So as an organization, what we have been doing through this lockdown is a 3-pronged approach. One is that I have made my phone number publicly available because I'm trained as a counselor. So I've literally made my phone number publicly available, and anybody who is in need to have a conversation, whether it is a person with disability or without, they are welcome to contact us and have a conversation about their reservations or whatever they may be feeling and going through. The other thing is that we are providing ration kits to families where at least one person in the family has a disability, and these people are currently out of work, so the family does not have a source of income. And unfortunately, we have also heard some instances of where the Indian government has a provision for providing pension, a monthly pension to people with disabilities who are in a certain strata of socioeconomic poverty. So we are providing ration kits and sanitary kits to families of people with disabilities, and we are also providing meals on a daily basis, cooked meals on a daily basis to migrant workers who are moving from the big cities back to their villages because of lack of work in the cities right now. That is something that we are doing as an organization. And whenever we talk about women with disabilities, we always talk about something called a double stigma and even a triple threat, because being a woman and then having a disability and then struggling with poverty. So these are all three things that individually come with their own challenges. And then when you put it all together, it just amplifies. So this is what we are trying to do as an organization to combat it here in India, but also through the Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network that all of the panelists here today are members of. So I will also tell you a little bit more about the Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network later in the conversation. But since I was talking about the compounded stigma that women with disabilities face, I think that is something that relates well to something that Paul posted yesterday on his social media. With the current global environment of the Black Lives Matter movement picking up pace again, and what that means for a Black person living with a disability, and how that that compounds the lack of safety that they feel in their environment. So I think that is also something that really touched me, and Paul would be able to expand a little bit more on that. So I'll hand over to Paul.
Hello everyone, I hope you had a nice weekend. I wanted to share my thoughts and my feelings and emotions linked to Black lives, equalities, and how it matters. You know, the murder of George Floyd in America has had a deep impact on me, not just as a Black deaf man, but and not because I'm Black and a deaf man, but can you imagine the suffering if I was in George Floyd's body, and if I was in his situation? Imagine if I was in that and I couldn't communicate, and the anger that would have enthralled in me. Can you just imagine if that situation and the effect that would have had if I was in that effect, or the double effect that would have had? So it's I could be open as a Black man in this situation, but as a deaf man, it would be an additional issue. Can you imagine that situation and the impact of that? I mean, I have had experience through my life is discrimination, whether that's being a Black deaf man or just being a Black man, both of them. And people just have to wake up and stand up and just, you know, and make sure that the justice, that there's the equality of Black lives, and that the future of the younger generation understand that behaviour is just not acceptable. It's really important for that, all those views to listen, and that there's some proactiveness forward for it. We have enough experience to share and put that together and push that forward. And my dream, my views of what the equal world looks like would be having no injustice, and all the children could be whatever they are, and there'd be no suffering and no frustration kept to one side. But we as a community is so important to link together, work together, support together, and how it really impacted me and made it feel, you know, with the coronavirus as well, and the impact of not and thinking about how do I cope with that. And I feel that double isolation and weight on me as added that initial pressure. And that's why I sort of shared that social media and the amount of people, the amount of things that have increased as a barrier, the lack of communication, the abuse that's happened for people. Everything is on the rise in terms of information being missed, not having vision interpreters speak English, and other countries in the world having that interpretation in sign language, and I'm having to use the subtitles, or I'm having to go and look at other organisations, deaf organisations, that are trying to translate the information the best way they can possible. And you know, language is power, and not having that access to that language and that information, and people not taking responsibility for that. And can you just it feels like you're back in the third world, and not having that accessibility. So imagine if you didn't have that audio for vision impaired, and you didn't have that braille, and you didn't have that wheelchair access and all those sorts of things, but there isn't that legislation to protect that and to ensure that that provision is given. And yeah, there's my presentation, if you like.
Would you like to tell us a little bit about your work during this time?
So yeah, my work it's been a challenge. And the reasons for this, I mean, I'm at home within my family environment. So I have my family around, and my family are all hearing. I'm the only deaf person in my family. So for the first few weeks, there was a serious incident that impacted me significantly. I was almost attacked and stabbed within my home. So an incident had happened that put me at quite severe risk, and that incident occurred because of a breakdown of communication, and the police had to get involved, and there was lots of procedures that, you know, processes that had to go through, and it was very complicated, and it was mainly because of communication breakdown. So that meant I had to take a couple of weeks off work to try and really find the new norm through this coronavirus. And I know that I'm not the only one. There's lots of people in this situation. It's very difficult to cope, you know, having to use remote interpreters, working with everyone remotely and working through that. I feel like I'm at the stage where it's becoming used to. It's not really for me to be in a room. It's not my character to not be in an environment surrounded by people. It's not an experience I've ever gone through. You know, I feel like I'm stuck in a room. And I worry that being in that environment, deaf people might hold on to things because they don't know who to talk to, because they've got that lack of communication and that barrier. And having interpreters remotely and having access to deaf counsellors are really, you know, is great, because as having a hearing family, it's been really difficult to communicate, and it's had a massive impact on my life. And it's certainly personally been a struggle for me, and not something I've experienced. But it's also identified my vulnerabilities. I mean, I feel I've got strength and found strength within those vulnerabilities, and had that insight of how the coronavirus has affected me and how that has impacted me through this situation.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think that was really powerful, and there's a lot to unpack there. One of the things I took away from that was the power of communication. And as you rightly said, interpretation, even with the Indian government and the way they have announced their guidelines, it has not always been a priority to do that in sign language. And we have also had to depend on other non-government organization or DPOs who are trying to do that for the community. So thank you for highlighting that. And next, I think we'll hear from Joseph Migila, who's a youth activist with albinism from Tanzania. and he advocates for the rights and inclusion of people with albinism. He's a mentor and disability consultant at Tanzania Federation for Disabled People's Organization. He's included me to youth ambassador and a committee member of the Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network. So Joseph, if you could speak.
Well, thank you very much. So I'm glad to be into this wonderful and significant meeting, considering how people with disability have been impacted by the COVID-19 currently. So quickly, I would highlight some few points considering people with disability, specifically in my country as an example. And I would like to hit this information into 4 main areas. And these areas are the issue of accessible information and accessible health services. And then I'll hit about the issue of economic situation to people with disability, and as well as the issue of personal assistance, or people who are assisting other people with disabilities, for instance, people with physical impairment and things like that. So quickly, for example, coming up with the issue with accessible information, well, is considering how the information has been disseminated to the publicly. Somehow it is really not so accessible because we have different groups of people with different kinds of impairments. And so from that point of view, the government and other institution bodies legally authorized to give information about COVID-19 should have ensured or should have considered the issue of accessible formats. I'll go as an example. For example, people with albinism can't read the small font information, maybe from the internet or maybe from the newspaper or things like that. So it is really, really a challenge. There should be accessible format, for example, sign language interpreters, how the information is being given to ensure that no one or any group is left behind concerning this significant information of how to fight this pandemic that hit our country currently. And the second thing is the issue of accessible health services. I'm not very far with what Devika highlighted earlier when he was introducing this meeting. Most cases, health services are not very well accessible to people with disability. And specifically speaking about my country, for example, it is really a challenge for people, especially with physical disabilities, being able to access the quality services from health centers. Same as with the accessibility information concerning communication. You find people with people who are deaf. There are no people who give service at the hospitals or health centers who are aware of this kind of language or sign language interpretation. So it is really a challenge, and my organization has tried so hard to ensure, and we have initiated some ways considering talking to the Ministry of Health and Services and Social Welfare here in Tanzania. And we are ensured that everything goes well, because at the end of the day, fighting coronavirus is a serious thing, which is so significant. And so at the end, we have to make sure that the government is really aware about how these social services, including health services, are being accessible to people with disabilities. And the third thing is the issue of personal assistant. For example, you cannot have a lockdown or you cannot quarantine personal assistants. Well, some people, specifically people with physical disability, need to have a personal assistant. So it is really a challenge because they need these people, they need that support. It is very significant that they need that support. And so having it is really, really important. Now, with COVID-19, it is really a challenge because in some cases, people had to stay inside. So people with disability might face that challenge of not being able to have such common services in their daily life. So that also went on to be a very big challenge that our organization also initiated and had addressed this problem to the government. And last but not least, speaking about economic situation, I will go quickly highlight some few statistical information. For example, in my country, 15% of our entire population here in Tanzania are people with disability. Statistically, here in Tanzania, it is 15% of the entire population here in Tanzania are people with disability, and less than 5% of that are people with disability who are employed on formal jobs. So you get a quick answer that there's a large number of people with disability here in Tanzania that are not employed into the formal jobs. Now, the challenge comes when we have a large number of people with disability who are not in formal jobs, and yet they're supposed to stay inside, they're supposed to be quarantined, they're supposed not to go around into their social activities, which really becomes a challenge. And so they can't, raise the economic standard. It is hard to go about through the day, considering that, people have to leave. Some people have just to find ways to just survive in a daily life. So with people with disability, it has really become a challenge. And Tanzania for Disabled People organization has highlighted this challenge, and the government has taken not very prompt response into this, but rather highlighted how families and social organizations could help and support this challenge facing people with disabilities. And I'm sure in the long run, as we are going about fighting this pandemic, maybe people with disability can face less challenges into issues with economic and living standard. So those are the things that I wanted to highlight, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Joseph. With this, we'll go to Pratishtha. Pratishtha is a student of political science at the University of Delhi. She has been a coordinator of the Equal Opportunity Cell of a college that works for students coming from marginalized communities. She's one of the 6 women selected nationwide for the Rising Flame I Can Lead Fellowship program that seeks to create leaders for tomorrow. She has represented the interests of young people with disabilities at various international platforms, like the Regional Consultation on the International Conference on Population and Development in Bangkok and at the Nairobi Summit. So she would like to share her experience of being a student with a disability living independently in the capital city of India. Hi, Pratishtha, you can take it from here.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Devika. I think one thing that has been troubling me the most over all these months is that news channels constantly all day in India, I don't know about other countries, but in India, they constantly talk about the impact of coronavirus on various things. But absolutely nobody, no news channel talks about how has coronavirus impacted people with disabilities. So that neglect, that has been there for centuries, and we can see it even today during this pandemic. And that is why I'm really glad that we have all come together today to discuss this and talk about this. And I really hope this will be fruitful. People with disabilities are at a higher risk than the rest of the population, mainly for 3 reasons. First is that, I, being a wheelchair user, I really cannot practice social distancing norms because, throughout the day, I require physical help from people around me for my mobility related concerns. I use a wheelchair, so if I have to shift from my wheelchair to the bed or perhaps anything, I require help from perhaps my parents or whoever is around me. So one is that. Secondly, even just the basic hygiene rules that have been given by WHO, like washing hands again and again, a lot of people with disabilities cannot do that as well. So in my house, my washroom is not really accessible, so I have to ask my parents to again and again take me to the washroom, to go wash my hands, and because there's a step to enter the washroom. So I have to again and again be dependent. Again, I cannot wash my hands throughout the day at regular intervals, secondly. And thirdly, the thing is that being a wheelchair user, I use my hands a lot for using my wheelchair. My hands keep touching my wheels, which will get dirty again and again. And how do I then go about that? So that is why people with disabilities are at a higher risk than the rest of the population. And it is very important that when the government makes policies around this whole thing about coronavirus, they should, think about what impact their actions might have on people with disabilities. As you rightly said, there was a boy in Chennai, a 23-year-old boy who is intellectually challenged. He is a boy with Down syndrome, and both his parents tested positive for coronavirus, and they were sent off to hospitals. And this boy was left alone. His caregivers were taken away from him, and he refused to eat, he refused to talk, he refused to sleep. He was in a terrible condition, and I don't think anybody deserves this. So even for myself, I am basically from Punjab in India, but I live in New Delhi for my education. So I live here alone. I have a caregiver who used to, who comes in the morning and leaves in the evening to, help me with grocery and daily work. And when the lockdown was imposed, because caregivers were not included in the essential services list, she could not come and help me with the stuff I needed her help with. For 4 to 5 days, it was all really problematic, and then I had to leave this place and go back to my house, so that I could take assistance from my family. So that really, I think it hampers a person's independence as well, in a sense. And it's not just about government policies and what to expect from the government. It's also about the society. It also brings along with it social stigma and discrimination, as it has always been. For example, I was at my home, and now, because lockdown measures have been they are not so strict anymore. So some family friends, they had come to my house, and they were okay meeting everyone at my house, but they said, no, I think you should keep Pratishtha inside because she is at a higher risk, and we do not really want to meet her. She might have the infection. So they, that stigma has kind of increased. People want to stay away from people with disabilities during this during this pandemic. So also the notion of home sweet home is not true for everyone. Not every person with disability is safe at their homes, and they are all kind of stuck inside their homes, and there are various kinds of abuse that they have to face: emotional, mental, physical. And there really has to be some sort of helpline, a number they can really call and inform about their condition, about their situation, so that they can seek help in some way or the other. Now, coming to education, I am a student at Delhi University in my final year, who wanted a great farewell and a good graduation ceremony, but couldn't get one because of coronavirus and the lockdown. But because education has shifted online, already physical, classroom mode of education was not accessible, and now suddenly it has drastically changed. Everybody is studying online, which has really impacted lives of people with disabilities, and has restricted their access to education in various ways. Firstly, one thing I've noticed is, so I have visually impaired students in my class, and one thing is that all the reading material is being circulated in the form of scanned images, which is not accessible to people who are visually impaired. So it's very important that educational institutions, teachers make sure that all the reading material that they send should be in accessible format. Other than that, secondly, they should be aware of what kind of video conferencing apps are they using. It should have facilities like speech to text and software, and speech recognition and stuff like that, so that it is accessible for all students to attend virtual classes, because a lot of them have not been able to get access online classes because of their impairment. And thirdly, I think a lot of teachers just assume what the requirement of a student with disability would be. It's always polite to ask their students that just send out an email and ask what are your reasonable accommodation requirements, so that you can really just a little extra effort would really go a long way in giving them a smooth educational experience online. But I think it is in this time teachers need to be taught. Teachers, because they are not used to of how to engage and interact with students with disabilities online, they don't know what accessible mode of teaching would be online. So it's important that, perhaps disabled people's organizations and universities, they collaborate to, uh, provide teachers with some workshops or seminars to make them aware of how to interact with students with disabilities and how to make the teaching and learning experience for them more inclusive. Now, in India, we are, at least for Delhi University, we are going to have online examinations, and students with disabilities have been against online examination for a long time. We had written to ministers, we had written to the government, um, and but still, despite all our efforts, they have gone ahead with it, and they have decided that they will conduct online examinations. Now, the problem with it is that, again, they the university will most probably, neglect the needs of people with disabilities. So if there's a wheelchair user who cannot sit for a very long time, they might require breaks while giving their examination, or um, you know um, the software used for the examination has to be accessible to a visually impaired student or a deaf student. So these are some things that have to be taken into account by the university. But one good thing is that, so the university, in our physical examinations, they used to give extra time to students with disabilities, and they have continued with this practice even in the online mode of examinations. So we have our exams in July, and there's still a lot of time for the universities to, ensure that these exams are inclusive and accessible for everyone. I would like to end by saying that, as I always say, that inclusion starts with I. And for all of us, whoever is watching this, if you could be a teacher, you could be an employer, a student, just make sure that in your own space during this time, you realize that people with disabilities are, doubly burdened, are doubly isolated, doubly marginalized. So just be careful of that and try to make your own space as inclusive as possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pratishtha. And I genuinely feel like those of us with disabilities, or those of us who are caregivers to people with disabilities, um, kind of automatically assume the role of activists and being the voices for people like ourselves and for ourselves, because uh, we have to make that change, and we have to make sure that the environment is accessible to us and to others like us. But I think the positive thing that can come out of this situation is that the people without disabilities, the non-disabled people who have experienced this lockdown, they would hopefully have a fresh perspective towards the mobility limiting factors towards people with disabilities in the society, and look at it from a more empathetic perspective. And like you were talking about, reasonable accommodations, those should now become the norm going forward. And that is not simply just to say that, oh, we'll shift everything online now. If you're doing that, if you're allowing people to work from home, or if you're allowing people to give examinations from home, that should also come with some infrastructure and training to be able to make that a sustainable factor as well. So thank you to all of you who've shared your perspectives of living with different disabilities in different regions of the Commonwealth. With that now, I would like to share, because we've been talking about all of us being members of the Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network. So I would just like to share a statement from our co-chairs of the network about what this is all about. And unfortunately, they're not able to join us today. So they've shared a statement which I will read for all of you. So you get a little bit more understanding of what the Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network, or as I may refer to it, CCYDN, intends to do, and how we can all be a part of it. So the Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network is a disabled youth-led network, including those who work with or have set up DPOs or NGOs working with children and young people with disabilities, whose mission is to strengthen the voices of children and young people with disabilities throughout the Commonwealth by increasing the awareness of their rights and supporting their participation and inclusion. We are the recognized Commonwealth Youth Network for young people with disabilities. Include Me Too, which is an organization in the UK. For over a decade, they have been supporting the inclusion and rights of Black, Asian, and minority, ethnic, and other marginalized communities of disabled children, young people, and their families living in the UK who had settled there from Commonwealth countries. The charity further strengthened its focus to increase disability awareness, rights, and inclusion, aiming to change attitudes for the benefit of children and young people with disabilities throughout the Commonwealth. It was during the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in London in 2018 when Include Me Too advocated for and organized the first ever Commonwealth Disability Youth Roundtable event, and young people with disabilities asked the charity to support establishing a Commonwealth network where their voices could be heard. During this roundtable event, young people with disabilities from Uganda, Tanzania, India, Sri Lanka, Australia, Botswana, Bangladesh, and United Kingdom presented on topics which matter to them and their peers. Young people with disabilities involved in the Commonwealth space through various networks and roles such as Queen's Young Leaders, Commonwealth Youth Council, Royal Commonwealth Society, approached Include Me Too to set up a Commonwealth network. The Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network was launched during the Commonwealth Week in London in March 2019, driven and developed by Include Me Too, with us, the young people who were involved with the charity, which listened to us and recognized the lack of representation and participation of children and young people with disabilities. CCYDN was launched in partnership with the Commonwealth Secretariat and the Royal Commonwealth Society, empowering children and young people with disabilities to have their space and influence disability inclusion, rights implementation, and increase their participation. CCYDN, led by the diverse youth with disabilities with the support and coordination provided by Include Me Too, is aiming to increase access to platforms for children and young people with disabilities as change makers and to influence positive change on issues that matter to them. We currently have representation from regions of Africa, Asia, the Pacific, and Europe, and are recruiting for a youth with disabilities representative from the Caribbean to join the committee. We also have young people with disabilities as advisors and will be recruiting mentors over the coming year. The network has two co-chairs, a youth representative, Mr. Jonathan Andrews, and the NGO's representative, Include Me Too CEO, Pami Dhinsa. NGOs working with children and young people with disabilities, enabling them to increase their awareness on their rights, inclusion, and providing access and support to their participation and representation are essential for the success and outreach of CCYDN. NGOs can support the future of these change makers, particularly those with complex needs and those who are underrepresented in the disability space. It is great to see the Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network. We are excited about increasing the visibility and impact of children and young people with disabilities, change makers for a disability inclusive society for all to thrive and reach their potentials and goals. We are currently working with youth with disabilities from across the globe to highlight the key concerns of the impact of COVID-19 on children and young people with disabilities. And we hope to arrange with QCT an update session in the coming weeks where CCYDN can share with you all the key messages and takeaways. So do get in touch with us. We are present as CCYD Network on Twitter and Facebook. If you want to get involved either as an organization or as an individual, become members of this network. We are bringing together disabled people's organizations focusing on the rights of children and young people with disabilities from across the Commonwealth, and we welcome you to join us in this journey. And I think now that you've heard from all the panelists, the challenges and the optimist aspects of what the other side of this can look like for people with disabilities, if anybody has any questions or inputs.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stephen Brooks. I'm ringing from a school in Birmingham, UK, and we're currently, just like everywhere else, only open for key workers and primary school children. But one of the challenges that we have had is during this period where people have been doing online learning, it's very much been standardized. And like you said, I think, Pratishtha, that it hasn't been personally, what's that word? So it's non-standardized. I'm trying to get the correct term. Please forgive me. It's near the end of the day here. But and I was talking to our special education needs coordinator, and it seems to be a very big problem. So I was speaking with the head teacher today, and one of the things that we're going to look at, and I do take your counsel, Pratishtha, again, ask people what type of support they need. Very, very important. And there's been a standard flow of information, and people have been pleased to be sending loads and loads of information, booklets and ticking boxes, but not necessarily personalizing and age appropriate and ability appropriate for the students themselves. So I do think that a lot more needs to be spoken about in this lockdown period and this COVID advice and guidance. I'm looking at school guidance from the government, and unless you are in a SEN school, it doesn't actually talk about provision for mainstream students who might have additional needs. So I think that is something that the Department for Education would welcome, that feedback. So thank you. I've been enlightened just in this short time I've been on here.
My name is Francesca. I have cerebral palsy. I'm 25. I work as a marketing assistant at Blackberry Eastone. So basically, we're a charity that helps to provide activities and opportunities for young people, regardless of different backgrounds. And for me, I've been quite lucky due to the lockdown, because I have got a really supportive family, and also, I mean, we have had to adapt because of, you know, the situation with my carers. So we've been trying to minimise that and work together as a family. But having said that, it has given me a lot more independence, and it's made me think about where I want to go in terms of the future and things down the line. I mean, unfortunately, I did lose someone due to the coronavirus a couple of months ago. But obviously, you know, I have been using this time to really work on myself and realise who I am and planning my future going forward, really. So it's been lovely meeting you all.
Paul just wanted to interact. He just wanted to say, really thank you so much. I really appreciate you, and thank you for the and thank you for all of these discussions. I've really enjoyed it.
Bye. See you later.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.